Hey guys, thanks for having me today. I do not have and never have deeply scripted remarks. What I like to do is talk authentically over several different areas, and that may lead to somewhat less rigor than if I was reading from a prepared philosophy paper that I had, but hopefully it'll also give you a bit of a sense of my journey and my thinking, as well as what might be the gaps in the thinking, which I would love to have criticism and suggestions. I guess Thomas asked me to talk a little bit about my history especially in philosophy and in South Africa and India a little bit, and then on the invention of Leapfrog and the growth of Leapfrog. Thomas, how long would you like me to talk for before? Because I would love to do minimal talking and maximal questions, but happy to talk for however long you think best.
Yeah, we want the opposite. We want you to talk all the time. So just go. Don't worry about it. We have 110 minutes. We're not going to run out. It's going to be fine. Okay.
So maybe I'll talk for 20 to 30 just as give the overview and the arc, and then we can dive into different areas you guys are interested in. So the thing to know, I grew up in apartheid South Africa, right? And I was the child of parents who were married in the summer of '69 and were hippies and moved out to the farm, were the first to be educated, and they were anti-apartheid activists protesting 90-day detention. And they sent me to the only unsegregated school under apartheid. And I was there with, for instance, the Mandela kids. And we used to walk past the apartheid army vehicles with people carrying big guns in the morning. And if we wanted to visit our friends of different races, we would have to violate the Group Areas Act and various other acts that the state used. And when you grow up in that context, you really have a sense that the world can be incredibly badly structured and not necessarily an assumption that states are good actors. And that really shaped me, because I was there on the Union Building lawns in Pretoria the day Nelson Mandela was inaugurated president in 1994 on May the 10th. And I was there with 50,000 other people. I was a student with students also of many different hues and backgrounds and approaches. And we were standing there together, 50,000 people on the lawns, and Mandela stepped up, and then suddenly we heard this massive boom. And almost everybody there involved in the struggle, so we all hit the ground, thinking that, the counter-revolution had come here. And then we looked up, and there were 6 jets trailing the new colors of the South African flag and saluting Nelson Mandela as the prisoner who had become president. And at that moment, I felt some of these concepts that we all talk about so much, civilian control over the military, the autonomy of citizens, etc. And I felt that the world can be really badly structured, but a small group of people then mobilizing a larger group of people can really fundamentally change that structural reality. And that stuck with me. And in a way, I think that the rest of my journey was just an attempt to find what are the mechanisms and what are the biggest structural challenges that cause the most unfairness, pain, and injustice. And what are the biggest mechanisms to actually change that, not talk about it only, but to change that. And I feel like I had some great gifts along the way of people who guided me. Eventually I did my PhD at Cambridge in philosophy under Amartya Sen, a great poverty economist, and philosopher, and under Nora O'Neill, a great ethicist. And they introduced me in turn to a man called Thomas Pogge, who, when you look at my books, they were written in Thomas's office in Columbia, because he lent it to me for the last bit of those books, and was really influential in my thinking. And as you look at those 3 people, in many ways, I think of them as the children of Rawls, and I think of myself as among the many grandchildren of that sort of Rawlsian notion of social justice, of thinking about the structures from the ground up, of reflecting on what maximizes the position of the least advantaged. And of course, I have differences with any philosopher, because I think one has to think for oneself. But I do think that tradition was very powerful for me. And if you actually look at the arc there, you can see that, you know, Thomas and Honora and Amartya were much more focused on the actual doing and the implications for practice than John Rawls was. And then in a way, there are a number of people who have since carried on, whether it's Christian Barry or me in different areas, who learned from those people and who have gone even more into the how do we take this into practice domain, inspired by those giants of the thinking in the field. And so that was the one influence on me, and I was and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But the other influence was really understanding what is that structural inequality. And in many ways, poverty is not apartheid. They are two very different things. But global poverty has some of the same features of being deeply structural, deeply ingrained, and actually created by the institutions that we have and the decisions we have. When I was looking at some of my earlier work, I looked at this book, Global Responsibilities, Who Must Deliver on Human Rights, and I looked at Thomas's piece in this book. And then I looked at my summary of the piece, and this was so striking to me about how much it shaped me. It said, Page draws strong conclusions about individual duties in this context. When an institutional order avoidably fails to realize human rights, then those of its members who significantly collaborate in its imposition are violating a negative duty of justice. They are not merely failing to help, but are participating in unjustified coercion. As it stands, then, the wealthy and influential citizens and states spuriously, quote, present themselves as the most advanced in terms of human rights and are chiefly responsible for the fact that most human beings still lack secure access to the most vital goods, unquote. And actually, I think you just need to substitute climate for poverty there. And you can see really very much the same story, that the great powers that exist, it became very clear to me, are extremely responsible for the way that the world is structured, and that our states and institutions, including corporations, have an enormous power to make change. Why poverty? Well, there's the sort of broader frame of this being one of the greatest causes of anguish and injustice in the world. But I also had a personal experience of working in India in the Thar Desert as a student with farmers. And I realized I was walking around saying, these people, if they just adopt drip irrigation, they're farmers, they've got the Indira Gandhi Canal and they're in a desert. They just adopt drip irrigation, everything will be fine. They'll triple their productivity. They'll rise out of poverty into the secure middle class, etc. And I couldn't understand why they weren't doing it. And I walked around saying, they're so irrational. They're so irrational with my sort of Homo economicus thinking. And then I realized a few months in that any new business, anything, adopting drip irrigation, whatever it was, has a small chance of failure. It might be 1 in 10, it might be 1 in 20, but that chance of failure meant that their children starved. And so I was the stupid foreigner walking in and telling them to play Russian roulette with their kids, with this new exciting thing that could change their lives. And what really struck me most powerfully from that failed development experience, and I still remember coming in on the train into Delhi, seeing millions of people in poverty along the tracks in the morning ablutions, living in shacks, and feeling, what can I do now? I still remember that realization that people could not take worthwhile risks. The system was structured such that there were people who might have enormous capacities who could change their own lives, but they just did not have the tools and the structures that allowed them to, the safety nets and the springboards that allowed them to change their own lives. And that was a structural notion that is not, that is not just mere coincidence. So if you think of this experience in South Africa and in India, some of them are very inspiring and some of them were very disappointing among my development experiences. But what they all led me to is the notion that the system, these broad systems need to be changed, and that it needs to start with what enables people themselves to take action. So I think autonomy and capability is at the bottom of this. And the story of Leapfrog begins there because I, as you know, had written all this work about the fact that when you have a right, you need a countervailing agent of obligation, following the likes of Honora and Thomas, and that states were mostly not the largest economic entities and often did not have the most power in certain contexts where I was working, whether it was in India or parts of Africa. And that therefore the agent of obligation is often a corporation or a development finance institution or multiple different agents, the multiplicity problem. Also that there are contexts in which there's the problem of emptiness. Who is the countervailing agent? And if one is not there, do you need to bring one here, and who is appropriate to bring here? So I became quite obsessed with that idea of how do you get that countervailing agent of obligation to understand its obligations and to act. And so I've given you multiple streams of what led to the creation of Leapfrog. Because in 2007, I started Leapfrog on the basis that you needed to provide people, low-income people, the billions of people that constitute half of humanity, with safety nets and springboards so that they can lift themselves out of poverty. What was going to do that? The state was insufficient to do that. Who was the most powerful to do that? It was going to be business in the capital markets. Why? Because Bill Gates may have 40 or $60 billion in the Gates Foundation, but for 4 billion people, that's $10 a person. That's not a lot of money. That'll be burnt in a day or two. Even if you gave it to everybody instantly with no friction. So where is the money going to come from? It's going to come from the capital markets. Trillions and trillions of dollars that change hands in the capital markets. That's the lever long enough to move the world. And businesses are hyper scalable because they can access all that capital and they can grow at enormous speed. And so they're best positioned to serve those low-income people. So that was the conclusion I came to. And I came to private equity in a funny way as the solution. I think I must be the first person to come to private equity as a solution to this kind of problem. Because I thought private equity is a way that you can get these people in the capital markets to commit a whole lot of capital for a long period of time, right? For like 10 years. We're not talking about put it into a stock today, trade and sell tomorrow or next week. For 10 years, people lock up a lot of money that you can then take as part of what's called a blind pool. And you can invest that money in companies, really grow those companies, and then hope that they graduate to have bigger owners that can take them on to the next stage. So private equity seemed like a way to start making, relatively long-term investments, access a lot of capital, and then the right kinds of private equity firms do quite detailed engagement with those companies. So you could have a very big influence on those companies in a way you couldn't if you bought a few shares of Apple, right? So the idea of having influence and creating value where you could get those companies to fulfill their obligations and to expand to reach more people with better and better safety nets and springboards became a very powerful part of the idea. So in 2007, January, I incorporated this entity called Leapfrog. It's gone through various incarnations since then. But the idea was, let's raise $100 million to start. Let's invest it in companies. Let's promise commercial returns, because then we can get the money out of the capital markets and this thing can grow. Let's invest it in these companies. Let's grow these companies and then sell them on to bigger owners who can take them on to the next big thing, return all the money with profit to the investors, and then raise the next fund. And let's measure and hold ourselves accountable. Obviously, I'm a Sen devotee, so I'm quite obsessed with the metrics piece. Let's start at the outset and measure, say what we're going to measure, and then let's hold ourselves accountable with an audit at the end. And the original idea with Leapfrog was raise $100 million, focus on insurance and pensions. The reason being, I was thinking of those farmers, and I was thinking that they really need to be able to take worthwhile risks. So I had actually, in subsequent incarnations, I'd worked at Ashoka as an MD at Ashoka under Bill Drayton, and in that context, I'd worked with Muhammad Yunus and Faisal Abed in Bangladesh on Grameen and Bruck and their new ventures. And obviously, work was being done in microcredit, wonderful work. Some work was being done in renewables. But fundamentally, credit at that time was being couched as the silver bullet. And I knew it was not the silver bullet because those farmers had access to credit and they had access to drip irrigation, but they still couldn't take the worthwhile risk. So I knew that actually insurance and pensions, where people felt they could invest, they could try things, they could try, and if the crop failed, they had crop insurance, or if the tractor that they bought failed, they could replace the one productive asset. That insurance and savings were going to be the crucial thing. And actually, one of my partners had led a 100-country landscape study funded by the Gates Foundation, showing that from low-income people themselves, and again, that's where it needs to start, savings and insurance were the two most demanded things. Credit was third or fourth, sometimes remittances was third. And the reason that those people, it's pretty intuitive if you actually think about it. If you're poor, you lie awake at night, not necessarily, a lot of people think, oh, I'd love to start a business. And that's the story that's told about microcredit. And I believe some of it, right? But if you're poor, what do? You lie awake at night worrying you're going to lose everything. You are on the edge, right? I come from a family that for a period, my parents were on the edge. And my family, and I know what that is. And that sense is something that is extremely widespread. So it is not surprising that insurance and savings, of long-term savings and immediate savings, are often the most demanded product. So we set out to invest in insurance and savings and pensions companies that would serve low-income people. And I stood up with this guy called Bill Clinton, who I didn't know from a bar of soap. I talked my way up from the most junior person at the Clinton Global Initiative until I was standing next to him. And he believed in the idea. And I said, we're going to reach 25 million low-income people with insurance or savings. And you can actually see that, that video online. And the reason I did it with him is I looked around and I saw a number of non-profit things that were now called impact investors. And all of them had not scaled. And part of why they'd not scaled is that their leaders were going to conference after conference, raising small amounts of grant capital. And so I wanted to go in one shot to a place where I could launch Leapfrog, not go from conference to conference, go out and raise significant capital from commercial people and development finance institutions, and then go and do the work of reaching these low-income people. And so we went out, we raised, just to give you a sense of how bad my timing is, Lehman, I launched on the 22nd of September 2008, eventually, once I put the whole team and structure together in proposition. And Lehman collapsed a week before that. It was in the Sheraton Hotel in New York. I was literally walking out of the hotel and seeing people walking out of the opposite building with their boxes, unemployed because of the global financial crisis having hit. And that was the time I was telling people, hey, we're going to go off to these exciting emerging markets, do this totally new thing with low-income people. Don't worry, I'm going to make you good money. So spectacularly bad timing in that respect. But we put together a team and a proposition where people had to see that, look, this is half of humanity that is underserved. The iPhone had been launched. It was very clear. We didn't know about streaming video or TikTok, but we knew that this was going to put a lot of people on the grid, and that once they were on the grid and engaged, they would be able to buy stuff at lower cost and access stuff. So we knew that there was a proposition there to provide something that was so demanded, insurance and savings, to low-income people. We knew that there were companies out there that were highly commercial, that could reach large numbers of people, and we were able to persuade people to take a punt on us. And the early people were the likes of Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, George Soros, Kelbit, Axion, and then we started getting development finance institutions like the IFC World Bank And eventually the likes of JP Morgan got involved and committed capital. And eventually we raised $135 million. And I will say that for 2.5 years, I took pretty much no salary whatsoever and just managed to survive until we had done that. And I very grateful for all the people who supported me along the way with that. Leapfrog has since grown. And I won't give you the blow-by-blow account, but we raised a fund. We succeeded with that. That fund reached 26 million people and generated strong returns. We then raised a next fund that was a $400 million fund with a target to reach 40 million people. And that fund has reached almost 120 million people, most of whom are low income. We then launched a third fund, $750 million fund, and so on and so on. And today, and with each fund, we widened the ambit. So we moved from, in classic sort of adjacency theory approach, we moved from insurance and savings into insurance, savings, and other areas of financial services like remittances, like credit, like payments, these other areas that affected low-income people and empowered them significantly. And then once we actually owned major stakes in 5 health insurers that were serving low-income people, we realized we could do healthcare. And so we started a healthcare team. And in our Fund 3, we introduced healthcare. And so Leapfrog now owns, for instance, the largest healthcare provider in East Africa, a group called Good Life Pharmacies. And I'll just pause to make it a little bit real for you with that in a minute. But let me just say, today, against that goal of reaching 25 million low-income people, Leapfrog's companies are reaching 442 million people. And the vast majority are low-income. Almost 300 million of them are low-income people. That means, on the World Bank definition, they're living on under $10 a day per purchasing power parity per person in the household. Now, when we've done our studies, it should be said, Leapfrog is not typically serving people under $2. That is a profound role for charity, government, and many other things, but those people are not typically in a position to purchase things unless it comes with certain other benefits or other sorts of payments to them. But we do reach down into the $2 to $5 a day zone. And again, if you think this is unintuitive, think of someone with one productive asset who may be a Gojek driver or an Uber driver in Indonesia or India, or someone who has one plow and tractor in India, and they're earning $5 a day. Let's say it's $150 a month as a family. Would you pay $1.50, 1% of your income to protect that asset? Probably yes. If you're a parent worried about what will happen to your children if you die, would you pay 1% of your income? It might be 5% of your disposable or 10% of your disposable to protect against if your children have the worst thing happen and you die? Probably yes. If your one chance to start a business is getting this kind of credit and the banks are massively overcharging you, would you use an online capability where you can get a pretty low cost solution and you can pay a small fee that's capped? Yes, etc. So, we actually do reach quite far down into the income spectrum of that $2 to $10 a day group of low-income people, which is the majority of the world's people. It's over 4 billion people. And our aim is by the end of the decade to reach 1 billion such people with multiple essential services. So we're on track to do that. There are 2 kinds of challenges related to that. One is, of course, continuing to back and grow companies and generate the returns from those companies to reach enough of those people. The other is, how do you get an overlap? Because poverty is multifactorial. So you actually want people to be able to insure themselves, but also have a good productive asset and lead the right life, but also not fall into poverty because of health events. And just to give you a feeling for how multifactorial it is, we often work with people now, farmers in India or whatever, through our companies Our companies serve over 100 million people in India. And you may think that, they're getting credit or they're getting a remittance or whatever, and this is great and they're rising. But 3% of India falls into poverty each year because of health events. Right? That's more people than there are Australians, if you think about that. That's over a 3-year period, more people than there are Germans or British people, whatever it is. This is a massive, massive group that is falling into poverty because of these health events. So you can get people credit, but they also need insurance. They also need healthcare. And so trying to get enough companies that people are getting multiple tools to change their own lives is really important to us as our 2030 goal. Now, just to make it real for you, because sometimes this feels like a bit of a black box, let me talk to you about a few of the companies that we back, because then that'll give you a bit of a feeling for how this is all done. It's not some magic, it's very practical. I'll start with Good Life Pharmacies in East Africa. So we invested in Good Life. We put around $30 million into Good Life. And Good Life was a group of pharmacies, 19 pharmacies serving people in Kenya. Now, what is the problem statement? The problem statement is that there are many little mom and pop stores in Kenya. Supply chains are weak. People have no purchasing power, so the medications are expensive because you're a mom and pop store. You just take as a pharmacy what you can from the big players that send stuff your way. When the government did a study of the quality of medication dispensing, they found that 1/3 of medications dispensed out of the pharmacies are fake, placebo, or misprescribed. So even if you get your kid diagnosed, you have a 1/3 chance they're not going to get the right medication, or they might get sicker because they're getting the wrong thing. And I myself have experienced this with, seeing people prescribe cough mixtures for things that are obviously not requiring that require antibiotics across many different countries. So that's the problem statement, and it's a massive one. And then you compound it with the fact that 50% of Kenyans, their first experience of the health system, how they touch it, is through pharmacies. Why is that? Well, if you go to the hospital, they are significantly under-resourced. You are going to have you're probably going to have to take a long trip to the hospital. You're probably going to have to wait in line for a long time. And then you're going to see, at best, a doctor after that period. And then it's going to be very difficult to get follow-up. And that doctor is going to be super overstretched because so many of the doctors that the country educates go off to the UK or Canada or the US or wherever, right? So you have a limited number of them getting educated. The whole system works where these doctors are a limited number trying to clean things up in very difficult, under-resourced environments. So, of course, people go to the pharmacy to see what can they do. So what can you do to change that? It seems like a really perennial problem. Well, we backed Good Life. We grew it into 120 pharmacies. But that's not the key thing. The key thing is we turned them into health hubs. So first, we got enough scale that we could negotiate down the costs of medications dramatically and be engaged very strongly with major companies that are suppliers of these medications. And we shrunk the number of suppliers from 100 random locations through to 6. And then we created tracking mechanisms and devices so that we could ensure that those supply chains were rigorous. Then we trained the pharmacists. The co-founders of Good Life were the CEO of Boots in the Netherlands and Josh Ruxon, who's a professor of public health at Columbia and worked with Jeff Sachs on a bunch of these areas. And so we looked at what were the key determinants, and the actual training of the pharmacists and the helpers in the stores was a key aspect of ensuring the medication was the right medication. Then we introduced telemedicine rooms. Why does that work so well? Well, you can be miles outside of Nairobi and you can walk in and you can see a doctor on telemedicine, and those doctors can see more people from more diverse locations. And 20% of the time, the doctor says, go to the hospital. right? And this is the nearest hospital, and this is what they need to ask, what you need to ask. So you're even empowering people for that hospital visit. But 80% of the time, it's something the doctor can actually see what the issue is, just as all of us during COVID were often having teleconsults. And the doctor can say what you need. Then the doctor writes a prescription online. It immediately goes through to that pharmacist who's standing in the store with you. And then what we did is we linked in 17 insurers into the pharmacy system, because it was now worth their while at scale to have a connection to this pharmacy group, who can then often pay for the medication if the people are insured. And we enhanced the ability to make payments. So now, what is happening in these health hubs, in places miles outside of Nairobi, in a very difficult system, is that people are having a better experience than I'm having in Sydney, or you're having in New Haven or New York. Because instead of going to your doctor, sitting in line, having a prescription written, then you take that, you go to the pharmacist, they type it into the system, they go to the insurer's system, then you follow up with the insurer, or they do. Instead of this whole complicated system, there's a closed loop, a bit like Apple, where the customer is taken care of from the outset. And that company is now bigger than the Aga Khan hospitals, which is the second largest now healthcare provider in the country. And we have a plan to keep growing it. And we've had major groups like Europharma now invest in that company. We've made profits for our investors because it's been a very successful company. We're still part of it. We still want to keep growing it. But that company now serves millions of low-income Kenyans. And the child who walks in, or the grandmother, is almost certainly going to get the right medication or be referred into the right hospital. So that's an example of where what I call profit with purpose. And the real promise of Leapfrog at the outset was that we would find and grow these companies, and we would find the synergy between profit and purpose by providing better services, better products. We would then build better businesses. And then when you went to sell those businesses onto people or institutions, they would pay a premium for a well-governed business that served its customer well, that was high growth. And then we would make more money for investors. And the fact that we were doing that in turn would allow us to raise millions, and now, billions that we've raised. I'll give you just one quick other example. We backed a small team out of Sweden, believe it or not, where a young Swedish guy had gone just after being a student to live in Ghana, and he'd realized that people didn't have insurance. And he realized that the mobile phone was the way that they were going to be accessing insurance much more cheaply. So he launched a group called Bima that intermediates between insurers and these low-income customers, sends people text, but also goes into markets with agents and provides insurance for that $1 to $3 a month per person. And then this Swedish team of people literally in their 20s went out and built a company that operates across 16 markets and serves over 20 million people with insurance. And we invested in that company. We made and grew it with them from the time they were in 3 markets. We sold our stake to Allianz, one of the largest insurers in the world, because they wanted to start reaching low-income people at such a premium, for $100 million. And we just put a few tens in and helped huge numbers of low-income people. 70% of Bima's customers have never had insurance before and are living in markets where there basically is no social safety net. So for the first time, these people have safety nets, and that has doubled Bima alone doubled the insurance penetration of Bangladesh and Ghana. So historically, X number of people had insurance in each of those countries, and within 5 years, it was 2X because of one little company started by 20-somethings out of Sweden and then built locally. That is a testament, I think, to the feeling I had early on in my career that a small group of people mobilizing a larger group can really structurally change the world. I don't, to be clear and to wrap up, I don't think that there isn't amazing work to be done in government. I think there's a huge role for government. I worked as an MD at Ashoka in a non-profit. I worked at the Carnegie Council. I was a lecturer at Harvard and at Cambridge. I believe all of these roles are incredibly vital and more to make change. And so please don't take me as standing and saying there's one true way. And, you know, I found it, I think quite the opposite, that I get very frustrated with people who think they've got the answer because that's an obvious nonsense. But what I do think is that historically, there was often a notion that you had to choose between being, you know, Mother Teresa or some, you know, slash and burn business titan from KKR and the barbarians at the gate. And actually, I think what I've tried to demonstrate as well as remonstrate about is that you can have both. You can have money with meaning, you can have profit with purpose, and that it is possible to very dramatically change the world using business and investment. And in some cases, it is absolutely the best thing to do. And that's the story. I hope that's useful.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Andy. So who wants to make a start? Yeah, Claire?
Hi, first of all, Andy, I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our class. Really enjoyed listening to Leapfrog. I think you explaining the purpose of the company and everything you've done is really amazing and is the kind of work that I think is really impactful and effective in eradicating poverty worldwide. The first question I have, I think would just be a good first question to open up the discussion. It's quite a silly one. Where did the name Leapfrog come from?
I have to tell you a funny story on this one. There were three places it came from. The first is that I love this notion of leapfrogging over stages of development. And having worked with Eunice, I was really excited about Grameen phone, because basically you'd had a landline grid that was completely sclerotic, it wasn't growing, it was a failed state in lots of ways. And Grameen phone came along, offered mobile, and people just leapfrogged to the mobile. And then suddenly there were these 250,000 village phone ladies renting out airtime, and it created this whole economy, and people were on the grid. And it was just this amazing thing that you could get something done in a pretty difficult environment. So I like that notion of leapfrogging. And, you know, as my best friend, who's a comedy writer and philosopher, says, you know, I always like to have my cake and eat it too. So I love that idea that you could make change quickly and not just incrementally. So leapfrog is one. Second thing, I found out that for bottles of wine, when you go and buy them, no one understands. Almost no one really knows wine. So everybody walks in and thinks they know wine, but really, like most people, you're just picking off the shelf based on something looking good. And when you put an animal on the bottle, apparently there's a 20% higher chance that it'll be chosen just because it creates a warm association. So I like the idea of an animal on the bottle. I know that's silly, but I thought, like, let's create that warm association. And then thirdly, I really didn't like the way private equity, how private equity firms seemed so brutal, you know, BlackRock, Blackstone, Cerberus. I mean, really? Like, I wanted something that was warm and nice, and like a frog is sort of sweet and jumps and, you know, everything. So I thought we can do private equity differently. But I will tell you the story that I'm laughing about, which is that our first award we won was for the name from Private Equity International. And I was just waiting for some recognition from the industry when I had $0. I was sitting in my, you know, at my broken desk in my apartment in Brooklyn, waiting for the, you know, award. And this was like, you wanted to actually send the copy to people at the time. So the copy arrives, and I was told I've won the award, and I opened the magazine to see, right, here we go, I've won the award. And it's got Leapfrog on the one half of the page. And then the other winner, it turns out there was a co-winner. And the other winner next door to it was Adult Entertainment Capital. They won for the name. And I thought, I'm not going to co-brand here. So I didn't get to send out the first award for Leapfrog.
They have a logo also.
God, I don't remember, but that's the story. I do think Leapfrog, the idea of being ambitious, I think appealed to me a lot. Often you're told by older people, well, you've got to make incremental change and all this sort of stuff. And I think sometimes that's true. Sometimes you've got to beaver away. But I wanted to make a lot of change and fast.
Okay, Bradley.
Hello. Sorry, my camera's not working for some reason. But I just had a question. It seems as though when you started in 2007, that technology and sort of developing technology certainly played a role both in growing Leapfrog, but also in the companies that you all invest in. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about how I think the rise of social media and the way technologies exist currently, but also potentially how you see future technologies impact both the rise of sort of Leapfrog and how you see it growing and developing in the future.
It's a great question. And actually, as we go out to sell Leapfrog to investors, the key thing I start with is another story of just watching Steve Jobs launch the iPhone. And if you think about when that was, it was 3 weeks before I launched Leapfrog in January 2007. And I had worked on Grameen Phone, and I had a sense that this thing was going to change everything. Billions of people were going to be added to the economic and communications grid. And that's exactly what happened. As I said, didn't predict some of the social media stuff for sure, didn't predict the intensity of interaction through streaming video and so on, but did predict that this was going to mean people could engage in commerce very intensively over these platforms. You can look up, we've just done actually a wealth and health study, an index that we developed that looked at 10 different countries. And came out with 54 different insights, a chunk of which are around mobile phone use. And it's incredibly striking. I mean, not only do people sort of join the grid and participate in commerce, and not only is the cost of customer acquisition dropped maybe 100-fold, and the quality of customer engagement maybe gone up 100-fold. So that's a lot of multiples. We put those two together. But people who have mobile phones are much more likely to seek early health care. So, we for instance, own a bunch of digital diagnostics businesses that are helping move that curve earlier as to when people are treated. Women are much more likely to use certain services and adopt certain goods that empower them because they're able to access things via mobile phone. Because otherwise, they're often statistically and significantly, there's childcare, so you can't just disappear for the day to go and get something from or get your healthcare miles and miles away. So mobile phone has allowed for better access and inclusion often. And you can look through, there's just a host of insights about why smartphones actually are pretty essential. What has happened incredibly excitingly, I mean, if I were you guys sitting at your point in life more than mine, the thing that would most excite me in terms of the terrain, the area to plow, the area to plant seeds, would be the fact that would be to look at India and say this is the future, right? So Aadhaar is a program that has resulted in every Indian, almost every single Indian, having a personal identification, a unique personal identification, thumbprint, eyes, signature, whatever it is, but there's an identification. Secondly, has resulted in huge opening of online bank accounts, hundreds of millions of them, into which payments can be made so that you disintermediate all the middlemen that were taking a lot of capital, and often stop the male head of households taking the money. And the third thing that it does is, the third thing that's happened is that there's been a massive price war around the provision of handsets and access to data. So the richest man in India spent $20 billion through Reliance Jio to create a mobile phone user base of 360 million people. That's the United States in like 2 or 3 years, and data was free. So they paid for the data. And so there was a massive price war where the opponents, the competitors, had to present very low cost data, very low cost handsets from China and elsewhere. And suddenly hundreds of millions of people in India are walking around with super cheap handsets, super cheap data, unique identification, and bank accounts. And I'm not talking about a 40-year process. I'm talking about like 3 years, right? If anything is Leapfrog, that is it. And so now those people can engage in all sorts of ways, and businesses are being started up in the context of that technology that are just unbelievable. I mean, we have a group called Redcliffe Labs that is doing pathology testing, like your home kits to, you know, send in your spit or your saliva or whatever it is, or your whatever to get diagnosed about what's going on. Now, this thing is now doing everything digitally, so much so that if you're in a rarely rural area, you can send your samples in by drone, because people can't get there easily by car, right? It is so amazing. It's driving something that is digital adoption of diagnostics. You would have had to go to towns, you know, 200 kilometers away through the desert, for example, in the place I was living, to get this kind of access. We own another group called MedGenome, and there's another area of technology that's so exciting, that is the largest genetic, so looking at genes, diagnostics and research company in the world outside of the developed world. And what they're doing is, for so long, as you know, Thomas, who's passionate about health, will tell you, the diseases that are researched are those that are most easy to research in a limited set of populations in the developed world. And as a result, there are the majority of the world's population does not have their core diseases, solution to their core diseases researched. So what, and solutions found to heart disease or diabetes or whatever these different things are, oncology like cancer. So what MedGenome has done is it started in India and it's now in Africa as well. And it goes out and collects genetic samples from a wider population base, people with different genetic histories. And on that basis, it builds out with pharma companies and others solutions to cancers and heart disease and other things that are driven by that genetic population and can be targeted to serve those populations. This, from an inclusion perspective, is massive. It is enormous, right? That you're not going to have the vast majority of the world's population taking medications that have been developed for Caucasian populations living in the US and Europe. It's enormous, right? It changes so much. So if you put these things together, MedGenome is growing incredibly fast. Redcliffe is growing incredibly fast. If you put this together, the most exciting thing, I think, sorry, I'm going on, but let me just finish this one. From a poverty standpoint, is that some problems that Thomas and I would have looked at 25 years ago that would have seemed impossible to solve may actually be solved. So, for example, I mentioned how many people have health events and fall into poverty in India. Well, the biggest problem is that the way it's being treated is clean up afterwards by that limited number of doctors. But Redcliffe and MedGenome and other companies of ours like Healthify Me are moving the curve way backwards so that people can get early diagnosis of things that might be risks for them in particular. Instead of just being told your broad group, you have your genetic diagnosis, or you have your wearable that tells you, you know, you're at danger of this, or you've got to do more of that. Or you have your sample that you can get very cheaply tested that tells you that you've got an issue. And you can start managing your disease and treating yourself very early in the process, often with AI coaching or whatever it is, and then some human coaching. So many fewer people will end up at that stage where they've got a chronic situation or a severe situation that the doctor has to address. And the doctors, as in the Good Life case, are often talking to people earlier, not when they're so desperate they finally decided to shut down their little business and have no income for these 2 days and therefore have no savings for the family or have to take their daughter out of school. No, now you can get online, get that treatment, and not have to take that consequence. So the opportunity here is to shift the entire health treatment curve way backwards to prevention and wellness, not just for rich people doing the discovery health thing, go to your gym and then we'll give you lower premiums or whatever, but for very low income people. And that can solve massive, massive problems of poverty in the developing world. So those are just some of the technologies that really excite me, and they're all coming together in a way that can fundamentally be transformative, and where I think, you know, new businesses in other areas, I think people should pursue and work on to mobilize these technologies. These businesses I'm talking about are just the beginning.
Ziad?
Hi, Andy. I just want to say thank you very much for coming and giving such a great talk. One of my questions kind of has to do with, you mentioned these populations are usually the ones that have all of, you know, they have their one productive asset. They're not able to take these risks, and, you know, losing these assets and taking these risks has huge potential ramifications for them. In that sense, you know, how do you, as, you know, the one investing in these companies, how do you vet them to make sure that they're not going to, you know, result in people taking a chance with them, taking, you know, buying insurance, and then, you know, the company fizzles out, not only at like the startup phase that you usually find them at, but you also mentioned that you usually give these companies off to, you know, bigger, more successful owners once the company has grown. So how do you vet them as well to make sure that they don't take what was one, you know, a very honorable cause and just kind of change it, and the people that bought into the system end up getting screwed over? Yeah.
Look, you're asking the toughest question in impact investing, and it's one I've spent 15 years working on. There's no silver bullet here, so I don't want to say anybody has the perfect solution. But there is a lot to say about how you can address this. First, just a point of clarification on what I do and don't do. So we are a growth investor. We don't typically back startups. There are others who back startups and earlier stage stuff. We typically take someone who's serving, you know, hundreds of thousands of customers to many millions of customers. And there's some amazing groups that do the earlier stage stuff. And you can look them up to groups like Quona, QUONA, or Flourish VC that do the more venture capital side. And actually, one of the wonderful things about impact investing, it's gone from zero when I started to being $1 trillion industry. If you look up the Global Impact Investing Network, you can actually find GIIN, you can actually find all the data on how big it's grown and how many managers there are and how there's an ecosystem of earlier stage to later stage now. All of the people from the earlier to the later face the problem you're talking about. So you back a credit provider. How do you know they're not exploiting people and charging excess rates? You back an insurer. How do you know they're actually going to pay out? You back a healthcare provider. You know, how do you know they're actually giving people quality treatment and so on? These are really serious questions. And then to the extent you're a private equity investor, you do have to sell it on, because the whole thing is to take them from cradle to graduation or kindergarten to graduation. And how do you know that they're not just going to rip it up or, you know, exploit that large low-income people population that company has created? There are a range of ways in which I've tried to, and others have tried to address this. The first thing is to understand the indicators. What are the things that matter in terms of seeing if people receive, low-income people receive quality, affordable, and relevant products and services. So I take those to be the three key criteria. Is it quality, is it affordable, and is it relevant, right? It turns out one of the wonderful things is that most industries have a set of metrics for that, because if you're Allianz selling to middle-class people in Germany, you have to account to your regulator that you're not ripping them off. So you have, for instance, a thing called a renewal ratio, which is, are people coming back and buying your product? And generally, if no one's coming back to buy your product, that is a sign you are providing bad value and are ripping people off, right? And so the regulator expects you to have a renewal ratio above a certain level, or they investigate, right? There's a combined ratio, which is also, and other ratios, which are very hard actuarial ratios that are about, is enough of the pool that the insurer is taking going back to the customers as claims payments, claims payouts, right? Or is the insurer keeping all the money and bugger the customers, right? Don't care about them. So there are these very strict industry norms that don't have to be invented out of nowhere. They actually apply and are relevant, right? And so what we did is we adopted first these insurance norms and metrics as we went into insurance and savings, and then we adopted across the different verticals we went into. So in healthcare and provision, you can have certain assessments of the medication and is it quality and is it relevant and is it affordable, how is it prescribed, etc. Now, what's interesting is the whole industry had to be developed. So the difficult thing here is we couldn't just invent this ourselves, right? This is an industry thing. So in 2007, September, I was one of the people who started what's called the Global Impact Investing Network. And that then created something called the IRIS indicators, Impact Reporting Impact Standards, or can't even remember. And it's now IRIS Plus. And what that does is it looks at different types of products and companies and what are the metrics that matter for those different types and products and companies. And it does a very wide consultation so that there's a broad agreement and it's an industry standard accepted. Now, after that was created, I got concerned, and after we started having more and more big players enter the space, I got concerned that you were going to have impact go from being me standing in the corner of the room with this weird idea to being something that was a marketing strategy that were good for people to raise money, and they could just and they could just meet the minimum standard and tick some boxes. So I got very worried about that and sat down with the CEO of the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. And eventually what we created was something called the Operating Principles for Impact Management, OPIM, which you can look up. And it was co-created ultimately by 60 different asset managers and investors, from development finance institutions through to mega players in the finance world. And what OPIM does is it establishes 9 principles, 9 standards you have to meet to qualify to be an impact investor. And it starts with that notion of quantification up front, where we said we're going to reach 25 million low-income people with quality, affordable, relevant insurance. Okay, how do you measure that? What are the indicators that we're going to show that, right? Then it goes through with taking that and having that in the legal documents. It involves, quarterly reporting onto investors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, the final principle is independent verification. For a bigger company like that, that's actually an independent audit that is fully expensive. For a smaller company that doesn't have that much money, you can get an authority who's external to do it, so it's cheaper. But we created that so it's not just self-reporting. Look at all this noble stuff I did. Right, we wouldn't accept that in politics or elsewhere. So why should we accept it in this, right? So that audit, Leapfrog, actually, so I launched that with the World Bank president in Bali in 2018 and the chairman of UBS and others. And then we did the first independent audit, Leapfrog, in the world against those principles. And we've just done the second one. Now, just to say, very few are perfect on this. In fact, Leapfrog was only one of 6 companies, investment funds on earth that got the perfect score across all the metrics out of the thousands of managers now. But it is something where people can track what they're doing well and improve on this. They can get better at each stage in the process, and they can use the metrics. And now they started being benchmarking, so investors can come along and say, hey, your competitor is actually doing better on impact overseeing companies and so on. At the company level, we develop the specific set of metrics, and they report on those quarterly. For loans, for example, you want to make sure that interest rates are capped, so that it's not that someone can take a small loan and then it compounds infinitely, so that 5 years later they're in total debt as can happen with money lenders. So there's a certain amount that can compound and then it stops. Just as an example of something that just intuitively to give you, so that you can limit a level of exposure. It has to be benchmarked against what others are offering. So it might be higher than in the developed world, but it can't be beyond a certain level, right? And that can be benchmarked. So there are all these different ways. Now, the last thing I just want to mention is the challenge of exit. And before Leapfrog came along, how people used to say is, don't worry, solve this is, don't worry, they've signed something saying they'll look after the company, which I call the Rupert Murdoch solution. Don't worry, I'll look after your editorial independence. You sign, you take the company, no one comes back later, and sues you for and tries to give you back the money because they're spending it, right? So and we give the money back to our investors, so we can't possibly do that. So what we developed was something called a responsible exits framework. And it means that the investment committee of Leapfrog has a fiduciary obligation to look at, does the exit not only maximize the returns of shareholders, but improve or keep the position of the low-income customers served. So it's a criterion of assessment. Our investment committees have historically had independent members as well, who aren't going to sort of sacrifice their reputations on this. And so you have to assess that very rigorously. And if you look at our exits, our sales, we've sold companies to the likes of Prudential, where there was and Swiss Re, their first entries into Africa and East Africa. So that now we've actually built companies for Prudential US, that was Prudential UK. So now all of those companies are actually in Africa, bringing all their actuarial knowledge and their capacity. And some of them are now some of the biggest players in their markets, which is really exciting. We've got the likes of Fidelity and Standard Chartered into India, serving people with credit, these microfinance institutions, by buying into our company, Northern Arc. So we've been able to bring people in, or Europharma in, where they bring a capacity beyond what we have. You know, Allianz has 1,000 times as many actuaries as we have. And that can really help these companies. So generally, we've been selling on to the right partners. And our biggest thing we obsess on is not that investment committee decision, which is important, but it is that the company's competitive advantage is serving low-income people well. So that investor who comes in would be highly irrational to rip up what drives the success of the company. That, to me, is the biggest thing we can do on a daily basis. We've got to make the purpose a key driver of the profit and success of the company so that they don't rip it up.
Okay, Athol?
Yes, thank you so much for coming and talking. I find your story really fascinating, especially the transition from academia to emerging market investment. So I kind of had a question it's really specific, and it was part of something that Professor Pogue sent us, the students, before this chat. Basically an AI chatbot. We got kind of an AI chatbot to answer some questions about Leapfrog, and one of them was whether or not Leapfrog aims to price its products and services below the profit maximizing price. And according to that chatbot, that's not necessarily the case. So I guess my first question is, do you price below the profit maximizing price? And if you don't, like, why don't you? Or how does that, couldn't you do more good if you were to price below the profit maximization price? And I guess also, like, an additional question is, maybe you talk a lot about norms and like changing norms and collectively. What if the norm to change is that we have to adhere to profit maximization? So I guess all that's to say is, kind of, would you be able to take it one step further if your company does price services below doesn't price services below the profit maximizing price, if that makes sense?
I love that question for so many reasons, but it is the first one I've been asked that's based on a chatbot interaction in my life. I'm kind of excited to see that. I'm kind of now excited to go on ChatGPT and ask it questions about Leapfrog and its idiot founder. Wow, there's so much to say on this. So first of all, just to bring it down to a very practical point about profit maximization, right? Any one of our companies could take a product and move up the cost 50 cents or down the cost 50 cents. I mean, clearly that is possible, right? So you can move the pricing around. And the immediate impact of a 50 cent less lower product would be helpful to the consumer, and the immediate impact 50 cent higher cost would not be unhelpful to the consumer. But I think that would be a very, very poor way to understand what's of value to the consumer and what profit maximizes. The reality of these businesses is the single greatest cost is what's called CAC, customer acquisition cost. And that's because if someone is middle class and you're selling them a Ferrari, they walk into your showroom and you don't have to have many Ferraris or sell that many of them to have a huge margin, right? If someone is low income and living in the Thar Desert where I worked, right, the cost of potentially reaching them is pretty high and the margin is pretty low, right? So what actually generates your returns? It's volume. It's volume, right? You need to sell 1 million insurance policies at $3 rather than 1,000 insurance policies at $3,000 if you have this business model. Now, if you can do it, of course, there are some actuarial advantages to this model because you have a larger end, you have a larger pool that is more predictive. 1 million people is more predictive once you have the data on them than 1,000 people, right? But your challenge is how do you provide something at a low enough cost? And how do you access those at a low enough cost? And the biggest problem is not maintenance of customers, because once they're on your system and you have digital, you can actually do it. The biggest problem is reaching them in the first place, right? What reaches people in the first place? Well, are you going to take out expensive television adverts? Are they all kind of on TikTok all the time? Probably if you're selling the Ferrari, you could have Mr. Beast or whoever doing stuff for you. You probably can't do it for low-income people in India, right? So what's going to do it? Well, word of mouth and referrals is the single biggest marketing tool that you have as a company. It's how Grameen and Bruck were built into serving tens of millions of people, not because they take out television adverts, but because this woman had a positive experience of taking out credit, building a thing and not going to the village money lender. So they told their neighbor, who told their cousin, who told her, and that's what drove the take-up of bank accounts and access at Grameen. So serving customers well, giving them the right product is the single biggest thing you can do from a financial perspective. I'm not even talking morally here. Of course, it's important morally, but from a pure, homo economicus, profit maximizing thing, the biggest thing you can do is provide that quality, affordable, relevant product and enable those customers to tell each other about it. That has a dramatic effect. So if I keep moving up the cost of the product by 50 cents and then 50 cents and 50 cents more, obviously people are going to start complaining about it, rejecting it, not referring you on to their friends, and you're going to start having problems. There are other areas where this is also true. And they also point to the kind of long-term iterative game notion that we're talking about here. So, for example, regulators. When you are a company looking to acquire and launch new products, launch any new, for instance, I'm sticking with the insurance example, but healthcare is also heavily regulated. Launch any new product, start any new major office, sell your company onto another major player like we sold to Allianz, you need regulatory approval. And if you are out there exploiting customers or offering substandard product, the regulator hears about it. I have a very different experience. When my teams or I walk into the regulator in the Philippines, there's a giant gold plaque outside that says, we will give insurance to all Filipinos by 2030. And I walk in, I say, hi, this is part of what we exist to do. And this is how we did it in Bangladesh. And this is how we did it in Ghana. And this is how we do what we're doing in India. And that regulator tends to approve new products, new offices, sales of companies, and acquisitions of companies, right? So my answer is yes, it is possible to price things higher and profit maximize at certain moments. But as a long-term strategy, it's irrational. It's economically irrational. You have to find the price point that gives the customer something where the renewal ratio is high, where the customer acquisition cost is low. And that involves people really liking and finding your product of value. Now, there's something that also is unappreciated with this, which is people think small is beautiful. They're really excited by the most exciting new young thing. There's not, the next Mark Zuckerberg in, insurance or healthcare or remittances or whatever it is. And those are amazing stories and inspiring and blah, blah, blah. But what really made a difference with Good Life was scale. Once we got to 100 pharmacies, we could turn around to the big German and US suppliers and say, we account for a huge portion of what you sell in Africa, where eventually this will be half of the world's population, right? This is a growth market. We account for a huge portion of it. We are at the forefront. Unless you guarantee us better quality supply chains and lower cost products, we're going to go to someone else. And that is what allowed us to reduce the price of products progressively, so that now someone is not only getting the 100%, not the 70% secure medication, but they're getting that at a lower price than the 70% version, because the bad mom and pop store is offering something of lower quality and doesn't have the pricing power. So I hope that gives you like a picture of the kind of thing that we're trying to do, but really it's about a scale and a long-term play those things, the thing about maximization from that perspective. And I always say to my team, if you want to maximize profit for yourself, go to Goldman or Apollo tomorrow. If you want to do profit with purpose over time, and you see profit maximization under a broader frame, come to Leapfrog.
Right, but doesn't that mean ultimately what you said, that if somebody is single-mindedly focused on profit and smart and long-term oriented, they would skin the cat pretty much like you did?
Well, I'm very pleased to say that KKR, the quote-unquote barbarians at the gate, TPG, Apollo, all of them suddenly have impact private equity funds and are raising billions of dollars for it. And why am I pleased to say it? Well, you can have your skepticism about these folks, but their capital does drive a huge amount of what happens in the world. And so I want to see hundreds of billions of dollars be raised for purpose-driven investments and purpose-driven companies. And then I want to hold those folks highly accountable. So I want the operating principles, the IRIS metrics, and I want a race to the top where I can already see they go out, and I hear about this, to investors saying, oh, we've got a better metric system now than Leapfrog. Let me tell you what we're doing. And I get thrilled when I hear that story. I don't get worried, because let them compete. Let them compete on the quality of their impact as well as the quality of their returns, right? And that's exactly the goal. And then I want to see it's moving out of private equity. People are doing it in private debt. People are doing it in listed, all of these sorts of things. Suddenly more and more of your investors are coming to you, whoever you are and however big you are. Instead of Warren Buffett saying, look, I don't really care about this stuff, like do your thing and just don't do bad. Instead of more and more of your investors saying, what are you doing about X and Y and Z? As some parts of BlackRock, some parts of Nuveen, et cetera, are starting to do. Wow, then you really start changing the capital markets.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really excited about this race to the top, and all of them starting to see they can make money out of this. And so much of life functions and markets function because of greed. Let's mobilize it for the right purpose.
Greed with purpose. All right, Jessica.
Thank you again for coming to speak to us. One thing that I wanted to ask was about something that we discussed in class, actually, that I thought was relevant. One thing we had talked about a couple of weeks ago was the idea of addressing poverty in maybe a particular or more limited country or region and raising up those people compared to addressing poverty on a much larger scale or perhaps more broadly. And since you just mentioned kind of your focus on scale, and also since I was able to see that Leapfrog helps in different countries, I was wondering if you could chime in on this conversation and give your opinion. I'm just wondering if when Leapfrog is looking into companies and seeing how they can help in different countries, are we focusing more so on providing healthcare here, maybe some pension here, or are we looking more so at the specific needs of the country first before we then look into companies in order to like match them?
It's a great question, and I wish I could have like a crisp answer if it's one or the other. Essentially, what happens is the way you make these investments is not by sitting in Sydney or wherever any of you are today and doing it. You need people on the ground. So, you know, the person investing in Good Life is a Kenyan-born MD, PhD from NYU who lives, you know, a lot in Nairobi and sometimes in Charlotte, actually. And he's there making those investments, right? So you've got to have your people on the ground, and the vast majority of my team of just under 100 now are in the ground. Our offices are in Mumbai and Lagos and Nairobi and Johannesburg, right, etc. So first of all, you have to kind of commit to the country and to a set of skill sets, because you need the talented people with the skill sets there. And then that creates the sort of the opportunity set. So I don't want to say that I stood back and said, hey, you know, wow, Kenya, healthcare is more important than education, and so I'm going to hire a person. I certainly didn't do that work. What I thought is we can do great work in financial services and healthcare, and increasingly climate solutions, which I haven't spoken to you guys about. And so I'm going to have a team in country that does that. Then they go out and look for opportunities. And it really is a sort of, with that profit with purpose lens. And I don't want to say that we have a measure that says depth versus breadth, right? So there are some companies that have a much bigger depth and much lower breadth. I'll give you an example. Shubham, S-H-U-B-H-A-M, Shubham in India is a housing finance company. By nature of housing finance, it's a really big asset. And so you're going to serve hundreds of thousands of people. But what are you doing? You're putting them in a home instead of a shack often, right? The implications for health, because there's running water, for sexual violence, because people don't have to live in insecurity, I mean, you just name the host of areas that exist for when you're doing that depth of impact. It's amazing, right? But it's a few 100,000 people. We have another company called Northern Arc that serves 99% women in India, that basically provides finance to microfinance institutions. So it's the wholesale provider. It was started by a woman who herself grew up literally with her mother foregoing, you know, 2 meals a day so she could feed the kids, became a banker in London, came back and started Northern Arc. It now serves 42 million low-income women, provides them with credit. Generally, they're starting businesses or using it for, you know, indirectly through these microfinance institutions or through dealerships of commercial vehicles that they use. But that's 42 million people getting a small loan. It's not a house. And I can go even further. You know, there are accidental death insurance policies. Only 2% of people use it. But when it happens, it really has a big impact on the kids and the family, right? So, you know, that is an even smaller group of people that benefit, but the benefit is just enormous because otherwise they're taken out of school and life is completely catastrophic for them. So there are different kinds of companies that have breadth and depth. And do we underwrite based on one or the other? I would say on a portfolio basis, yes. So we'll start saying, you know what? We've got a lot of credit businesses in this. First of all, that's too much exposure to a sector. Secondly, we're getting very wide, but are we going deep enough here? And that's more of an intuitive kind of judgment. But on an individual company basis, we just look at best in class. The investment committee looks at it and says, is this profit with purpose? Is this going to have a big impact and generate strong returns? And if someone from that team brings us in the right sector or subsector, generate strong returns, have a big impact, and we underwrite those separately, we don't trade one off against the other, then it's going to go through.
Ariana?
Hello. I also share the same sentiments as like everyone else, like thanking you for your work, like with Leapfrog and everything. But my question was more tailored towards like the beginning of your presentation and like your thoughts and philosophies that started Leapfrog, because like a lot of our like debates in this class are centered around like the responsibility and culpability and like attacking poverty. And like, I guess I'm still kind of confused about like why you designated like corporations being the one who are most culpable to attack poverty, because like I understand that like in the beginning you said that the corporations were the agent of obligation, and that you said the reason for that was that they had like the greatest access to large capital. And I understand like because of that, like they would be the most equipped, but how does that make them like the most responsible or like having the greatest duty?
Yeah, this is obviously a very deep and important area. And you're right. It's not an argument that we should take for granted. It's one we should interrogate very strongly, just because it sounds good. Hey, you know, you have money, why don't you give it? Or you have power, why don't you use it? Sounds like it's a very easy pitch, and not necessarily persuasive. So you have to think quite deeply about it. And the first thing I want to say is I don't believe it's corporations only. What I believe is that there was a big bait and switch that Honora O'Neill has spoken kind of elegantly about, of starting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by saying, all people shall have rights. And then the next sentence is, and the state shall secure, right? And then you suddenly realize, well, some people live in, you know, the Congo, and some people live in Syria. And some people live in parts of the United States where, frankly, the state has not been especially effective and can't necessarily be relied on to think about those people inclusively. Now, of course, you can work unbelievably hard to change the political structures in your country or in another country. You can think, you know, the dictator in Syria needs to be deposed. You can think I've got to reform local government in New Haven or national government in Australia, or whatever your location and focus is. And I would never, ever want to take away from that. You know, as I say, I started in apartheid South Africa, right, where changing the government was the necessary precondition for almost everything. It was a racist autocracy, right? So I really never want to claim that government isn't a huge part of the solution. And I actually think if you read Maria Mazzucato, there are parts in which having a more activist state is incredibly important, and where some of the work that states have done to change the situation of poverty is really deeply unappreciated. So please never get me wrong on that. Also, never get me wrong on the Peter Singer debate, you know, which Peter does, which is I believe in charity. I try and give myself, I believe we should all give more. And I don't believe that there isn't a role for charity. And as I said, especially for the group of people living under $2 a day per person, I believe that nonprofits, development finance institutions, states have enormous obligations. And I believe there are limitations to what, say, a Leapfrog can do when people have no purchasing power. So again, this sort of idea that we're the one truth and we're going to solve it all, or corporations are going to solve it all, you know, I think would be spurious and appalling, frankly, and misleading. Why do I think corporations then have an important role, and companies? Well, the first thing, and it does start with that Peter Singer piece, is that much of poverty relief is achieved through business. There's just no doubt about it. And you know, whether you're sitting and talking to the president of the Rockefeller Foundation or anyone who's involved in it day by day, they will tell you that a big part of their role is to try and be catalytic. You know, Mark Sussman, who's an old friend of mine and whose aunt was a great hero of the anti-apartheid struggle, he's the CEO of Gates Foundation. He spends a lot of time trying to mobilize coalitions of corporations and businesses and encourage them to do more, because that's where a huge amount of the capital and the capacity sits, right? So there is the capital and capacity, and often in places like Ogoniland in Nigeria, Shell and certain institutions probably have more power and capability than the local authorities. That's just that's a reality, and possibly than the national authorities, right? So we just need to look very carefully at this and acknowledge that the power and capabilities are distributed between multiple agents. Now, there's a long leap from that to that those agents have an obligation to do something. and Thomas is much more of a guru, so I feel, it's even problematic for me to be offering thoughts on this when he's in the room. But, there are a few ways to think about it that I think are helpful. I mean, the first is that the practices that those players engage in and the communities they engage in do create obligations. So where you are taking action that has an effect on people, whether your employees or your customers, you do have certain obligations with respect to them, whether they're obligations of non-exploitation and fair treatment that lead you to have to understand what world they operate in, whether it's certain regulatory obligations that you have, whether or not those are being enforced. Those are moral and legal obligations that you have as an institution. And where you are the major power or one major power in the context, you find that those obligations can take you quite far, right? Because you're enmeshed in regulation, in direct treatment, in community engagement, right? And in the social license to operate. Beyond that, you have, I believe there is a further positive argument that is around this profit maximization point, that institutions, and it's a point that's been made by the former CEOs of the likes of Unilever, who deal with very large low-income populations and where their business model is based on reaching large numbers of low-income people across many markets. You have it is rational to be moral, as I've explained, on the basis that you're going to have more social license to operate, you're going to serve people better, you're going to do better. So the argument that you shouldn't do that, because there is something that sort of runs against that, ends up being quite weak, because how people tend to make the argument is, I have other obligations to my shareholders who are also pensioners and so on, right? So you can make this very evocative, this argument. I have other obligations to my shareholders that trump these purported obligations that either don't exist or are weak. Perspective to fulfill these obligations, then some of those arguments that they have really fall away. So that's the second point I would make, because that's often how I see the argument made, as an argument about greater obligation elsewhere. And then the third set is Thomas's argument about, I guess, negative obligations. And this does speak to the Peter Singer question, because what is the generalizable view of that child in the puddle story, right? It's that if we can structure our social institutions, and that may be corporations, or it may be states, or it may be other institutions, to pull thousands of children out of the puddle, in fact, millions of children who are dying from avoidable diseases and challenges. If we can structure our institutions to do that at no or very low cost to ourselves, arguably you are required to do so on various, whether utilitarian or deontological grounds. Now, I think that's a broader argument than the individualist argument that Peter Singer offers. I think it requires much more complex empirical discussion about the structuring of those institutions and what's rational for those institutions and who are the people who benefit from those institutions. Because I do think that pensioner in New Haven or in Nigeria has a right to have their capital invested well, and not just, and so I think there is an obligation, fiduciary obligation, and moral one to those people. It's not just random investors with lots of money. It's, hey, you billionaire, give us the money, right? It's really not that. It's more complicated than that. So I think it is complicated and much more, there needs to be much more empirical work done on that. But I do think you can make that case fairly strongly. Thomas, I don't know if you had further things to add there.
No, we go to Magna now because I take her first because she has not spoken yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, again for your time. So I have a question about specifically like tradable goods industries. You've talked a lot about financial services and healthcare, but I am wondering, I'd like to push you a little more on the price point question. I feel like in tradable goods, textiles, manufacturing, that's where the need to reduce, or sorry, the need to potentially allow prices to increase to allow for better wages and better treatment of workers does become valuable, and reducing the price point is part of the problem. Do you think impact investing has a role in enabling that shift? Because I haven't seen enough of that in the impact investing space. That's
about me in terms of the tradable goods and textiles and so on is that my wife is a human rights lawyer who founded the Migrant Justice Institute. You can look that up online, and that focuses on especially on migrant workers. And one of the issues that she has been one of the most vocal people probably in the world on is wage theft. And exploitation of workers, where prices are driven. Essentially, you have the big supermarket chain or whatever, or the restaurant group, or whatever, insist on the prices being brought down for people, and then that's pushed down into the suppliers, and then the suppliers send it out to and who takes the pain at the bottom? It's the workers, and particularly the migrant workers who don't have a voice. And don't have power in the situation. So, and just to give you a sense, if you think that's a small group of people in developed countries, talking about Singapore and Australia, it's 10% of the Australian labor force. Like 1 million people who are those migrant workers, so it's a problem for developed countries, as you said. That there is this, Adam Smith, the famous example of saying it's harder to be poor in a rich country sometimes than poor in a poor country. You can't go for an interview without a shirt, or in a difficult situation in certain countries, for example. But this is a problem, I guess I want to say, for rich societies as well as poor ones and poorer ones. And I think should lead the likes of us from Singapore and Australia, who feel comfortable and self-satisfied sometimes, to really interrogate ourselves, because there's a dark underbelly to to all wealthy societies. So on the pricing point, there are absolutely minimum standards that say, I think, of treatment to which people are entitled, either morally or by regulation, that profit maximization should not overcome, right? And that's just about the dignity of the person and the expectation of non-exploitation, right? And that trumps certain behaviors. You can't just say, well, it profit maximizes to chain children to desks and they're very cheap. That's clearly, and therefore that's good for society on the whole, because eventually it all rises. There are some very clear, whether it's deontological or utilitarian rule constraints on what you can justify from a medium-term or long-term over time net improvement argument, right? And I think this class, probably you guys are having discussions about those, and I won't go too far into those, but needless to say, my wife works on that on a daily basis. And a lot of the problem is not that we don't agree on what those are, but the problem of enforcement, because there's a widespread, oh, we've got to do something. The ombudsman is weak, the state doesn't enforce it. And if you think this is about Bangladesh, where obviously I've done a lot of work, sure, but just to give you the stats from Australia, again, one of the richest countries on earth, 1/3 of migrant workers are being paid less than half the minimum wage. So this is not a few bad actors. This is, 1/3 of those people, less than half, which means they're either being asked to do double the number of hours, or half their money is being stolen from their pay packet. So, if you think about the scale, and there's And that's in a country that's renowned for enforcement, for the big nanny state, where people are happy to pay taxes, right? So we need to turn our minds not just to what those constraints are, but about how you solve the problem of agency and enforcement in that context.
Okay, we have a few more minutes left and two more questions. One is, let's ask them together. Claire is the first, the other one is on the chat.
Okay, I think Abby also has a hand raised as well.
Yes, I didn't see that.
Maybe
Abby, you had a hand raised?
Yeah, but
Oh, I'm so sorry.
go ahead.
I didn't see your hand,
No worries, I just raised it.
but then we do all three.
Okay, my question's actually quite long, and in the interest of time, maybe I should let Abby and the question in chat have the floor, because there's no way that if I ask mine that will be done anytime soon. So
Okay, Abby.
Yeah, my question was regarding kind of the growing wealth gap even within, poor nations. And I think someone mentioned earlier, we do discuss a lot about kind of responsibility and whose responsibility it is in this class. Do you feel as though people who live in nations that are poor and are extremely wealthy have a greater responsibility to alleviating poverty in that context? Or do you think it's kind of a global issue and shouldn't be, siloed off to nation-specific contexts?
And the chat question is, my cynical question is on some real world metrics, great technology / solutions, but what is the target return profile? How long does your patient capital stick until you want to see the returns?
Right. Well, I can answer that cynical question quickly and then come to that one. I think it's not a cynical, I think it's an appropriate question, and one should be giving people a hard time on the uses of their capital, especially if they're claiming to do it morally. The return profile is private equity returns, which at different stages for different, in different markets is benchmarked differently, but typically you're going to see out there private equity returns that range from the 15 targets that range from the 15 to the 25% internal rate of return, and typically private equity investors are seeking 2 to 3 times their money. So that's what people are looking to generate. It's not 10 times, but nor is it just like a low yield thing that you could get in a savings deposit account or say a private debt fund that might be offering you 8 or 9%. So that's just to give you a sense of that. How long does it stick around? So two quick answers to that. The stick around, typically we hold a company for between 3 and 7 years. We've generally had a longer profile, partly because things like insurance and healthcare and so on take longer to come through. It's just a business model thing. And partly because we tend to be quite attached to companies and like to grow them. And we think we can give people a better, what's called MOIC, which is money on invested capital, a better multiple if we hold it longer and it grows for longer. The actual amount that comes out, not just the percentage, is higher. So we like the longer hold. And then we try and sell it on to someone who will be very patient, like a Prudential or whatever, who will hold it for longer. We have sold on to other private equity who would then sell it on to a strategic. There is a new development in private equity. It's quite interesting, called continuation funds, where you can take some of the best assets and hold them for longer with lower returns. So you have an asset, you said investors, hey, roll this out of the fund, keep it. Like Good Life would be an example. We've had it for a long time now. Let's turn it into a continuation vehicle. And then you can hold it as it goes from 120 to 200 to 500 pharmacies, chains, or pharmacies and health hubs, and you don't have to let go of it. But it'll have a lower yield, and that's fine because it'll come. It's lower risk. So that's the answer to that. On the who has obligations, I mean, again, I think, the book, the Global Responsibilities book is old, but it has some classics. Don't read, you don't have to read mine, but it's this one, Global Responsibilities, Who Must Deliver on Human Rights. And Thomas is in there, and Nora and David Held and Peter Singer and so on. If I get your question correctly, there is, rising inequality along with the fact that there has been a significant reduction in, not during COVID, but over the past years, very significant reduction in poverty overall, and particularly severe poverty, but in general that has reduced. That makes it a very interesting sort of moment as you think about, practically especially, but also philosophically, as you think about maximum of what maximizes the position of the least advantaged, because inequalities are growing, but they're also at the same time as large numbers of people rising out of poverty. And you only have to look at China or India to see this, or Nigeria where we work, or Kenya. And I think those sorts of principles is what was underappreciated in some of the early Rawlsian thinking, and I would be interested to hear Thomas talk about this at length. But what I think was underappreciated was how those inequalities create compounding difficulties over time. So just how much those inequalities result in people changing the rules of the game for themselves and the power relations changing. And I think it's something we can only think of as self-evident now. But that is the thing that needs to be thought hugely about, because it's not just, is it in this one instance that it changed the game, but after it becomes structural and vast, how does it change the game? And I think as you look at developing countries, I certainly don't think it makes any sense to just blame the former colonialists or blame the Americans or blame the Singaporeans or whoever it is, right? Clearly, there's a nesting of actors here who are jointly responsible for this in the situation. I come from South Africa, that went from Nelson Mandela to Jacob Zuma quite quickly, and is now teetering in between somewhere. If you think about this, the philosophical challenge of unbundling who's causing some of these challenges is enormous, and the practical challenge. But I think the orientation has to be, there's no one agent that it's the state, or it's those baddies in corporates or whatever. The philosophical orientation has to be, this is overdetermined by multiple actors. Let's try and understand empirically who's doing what, who has the capabilities to do what, and the resources to do what harms are being caused by whom collectively or individually, and then unbundling that into, well, what are the obligations that they have to change that? And if that sounds very general, I think it can be quite specific. If you look at a particular country like healthcare in India or whatever, you can end up saying, well, the state should provide a certain minimum and can pay for X, Y, and Z, but can't do more than that. But it also needs to be especially preoccupied with people under $2. The nonprofits need to be doing this. The corporation, well, there are large groups like Tata and Mahindra and Jio that reach down the income spectrum, and they are serving these people, and they do have certain obligations and capabilities. And you can dig into each country and the set of issues and start offering that kind of more nuanced answer on the obligation side. I know we've run out of time. I'm sorry, but I've
run out of time. But it was a wonderful session, Andy. And if you were here in person, we would now take you for dinner.
Oh.
Maybe at a college or maybe at one of New Haven's fine dineries. But sadly, you are not. But next time you pass through, it's a promise.
That would be wonderful. And
So
Thomas,
thanks
you
a million.
inspired me when I was the age of most people around this table, roughly. So I feel like the only thing I can do is come back and talk. And I really do think that that philosophy can be the most powerful discipline and force in lots of ways, questioning what people take for granted and coming up with new ways to change things. And it can be an incredible moral force in this world. So I'm glad you're all fighting the good fight, and that, Thomas, you're still leading us in our thinking on this.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.